The sea was unusually calm that morning, a wide sheet of silver stretching into the horizon. The kind of calm that sailors distrust, because it feels less like peace and more like a held breath. And it was in that breathless silence that the ship appeared. No one saw it approach. No sails cracking in the wind. No distant silhouette against the sky. It was simply there, resting on the water as if it had been waiting. The first men who saw it thought their eyes were playing tricks. The vessel drifted slowly, not in distress, not spinning the way an abandoned ship usually does, but moving with a strange steadiness, almost purposeful. From a distance, nothing seemed wrong. The masts were upright, the rigging intact, and the hull showed no scars of battle or storm. Yet even before they reached it, the men felt a creeping sense that something was terribly out of place. They called out to the ship. Their voices echoed over the flat water. No reply came back. Not a figure on deck. Not a hint of movement. Only the gentle slap of waves against the wooden planks. As they drew closer, the silence thickened. A ship at sea has its own breath, creaks, footsteps, ropes shifting with the wind. But this ship breathed nothing. It floated like a corpse. The boarding party hesitated at the ladder. They expected signs of panic or struggle, maybe smoke from the galley or torn canvas. But everything was pristine. Too pristine, like a stage set moments before the actors walk in. One of the men placed a hand on the railing. The wood was warm from the sun, dry, and perfectly smooth. Nothing about it hinted at chaos or abandonment. That, in itself, was the first unsettling detail. They stepped onto the deck. What they found there chilled them more than a storm ever could. The deck was completely empty, not messy, not damaged, just empty. Coils of rope lay neatly arranged, as if waiting to be used. Buckets stood upright. Barrels were sealed. Even the captain's spyglass rested exactly where it should have been. But not a single footprint marked the dusting of salt on the planks. It was as though the crew had vanished without disturbing anything around them. The men moved cautiously, calling out again. Their voices carried through the corridors and returned unchanged, without the faintest suggestion of human presence ahead. It was like shouting into a house long forgotten. Then they noticed something else. A soft lantern glow flickered from inside the main cabin. Someone had left it burning. It swung slightly with the ship's movement, casting slow, wandering shadows on the wall. The flame was low, near the end of its oil, which meant it had been burning for hours, maybe longer. They pushed open the cabin door. Inside, the table was set for breakfast. Bowls, utensils, mugs of water, bread half-sliced, a tin of salt open, a knife resting on a plate as though the hand that held it had simply stopped. The water in one of the mugs hadn't yet evaporated. It was still cool to the touch. And that was the moment the men realized the truth. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't happened days ago. It had happened recently. Very recently. They began searching the rooms with more urgency. Every cabin told the same story. Clothes neatly folded. Personal items arranged. Blankets still warm from the morning sun filtering through the portholes. A pair of boots stood beside a bunk, perfectly aligned. Someone had been about to step into them, and then they hadn't. But two discoveries would unsettle them the most. The first was found in the captain's quarters. His logbook lay open on the desk, quill beside it. The ink stroke ended abruptly, mid-word, as though something had interrupted the captain mid-thought. His handwriting, confident and measured, simply froze. The last recognizable sentence read, "The men have begun to sense something," and nothing more. Not a blot, not a smear, no sign of hesitation. Just a sudden, unnatural stop. The second discovery was found near the stern, a lifeboat missing. Only one. But the ropes that should have been cut or untied were untouched. The missing boat had not been lowered from the ship. It should have still been there. Yet the ropes hung perfectly still, unbroken. As the men stood there, staring at those ropes, a chill crept across their skin. Something was wrong with the logic of this ship. Wrong in a way that didn't fit storms, or mutiny, or pirates, or any danger they knew. They regrouped on deck, each man sharing fragments of what he'd seen, trying to piece together a narrative that made sense. But every detail contradicted the next. A meal left mid-bite. A logbook sentence cut off. A lantern burning low. A missing lifeboat that had not been lowered. A deck too clean for an evacuation. A ship too whole for disaster. One of the sailors finally said aloud what the others had been thinking but avoiding. It's like they were taken. Not attacked. Not drowned. Taken. The wind picked up slightly then, brushing the sails with a faint whisper. The ship responded with a small, hollow creak, its first sound since they had boarded. The men turned toward the horizon. The sky was still empty, the sea still impossibly calm. Nothing around them explained the silence. They walked those decks for over an hour, searching for anything out of place, any clue that would disturb the perfect stillness. But every corner of the ship looked like life had been paused, not ended. Like time itself had been interrupted. There was no blood, no weapons missing, no torn fabric, no signs of dehydration or illness. Nothing that fit a story humans could understand. The last place they checked was the cargo hold. The lantern they carried swung gently as they descended the steps. The air grew colder the deeper they went. The smell of the sea mixed with wood and iron. Everything seemed normal, until they heard it. A low, rhythmic sound. Soft, almost too faint to catch. It echoed once through the hold, long and distant, like a heartbeat traveling through water. The men froze. They waited. It happened again. But when they searched the floor, the crates, the corners of the hold, they found nothing. Nothing alive. Nothing dead. Nothing at all. And yet the sound had been unmistakable. They climbed back to the deck in silence. No one spoke of the noise. Not yet. They didn't want to believe it. Didn't want to acknowledge that the one sound they'd heard since boarding the ship was something they couldn't place. When they finally returned to their own vessel, they looked back at the abandoned ship as it floated in that unnatural calm. It seemed almost peaceful, almost serene, as though the ocean had claimed it and was waiting to decide what to do with it next. One of the men whispered, barely audible, "A ship doesn't return alone." Another replied. Then something else brought it back. And with that, the first chapter of the mystery began, one that would haunt historians, sailors, and scientists for more than a century. The investigation began the moment the men returned to the abandoned ship. They came armed with lanterns, notebooks, and a growing sense that they were not just examining a derelict vessel, but stepping into a moment of history that had collapsed in on itself. Every detail mattered now. Every scratch on the wood, every misplaced object, every scrap of paper might reveal what the crew had experienced in their final moments aboard. The first place they revisited was the main deck, not because they expected to find anything new, but because the emptiness itself felt like a clue. The deck was too clean, too untouched. A ship at sea is a living organism. Sailors walk, work, eat, sweat, drop tools, leave marks. Yet here, the air felt preserved, like the inside of a sealed box. One of the investigators knelt beside the mast, running his fingers across the planks. There were no drag marks, no footprints, no signs that heavy objects had been moved or that anyone had run across the deck in panic. Salt lay in a thin layer, unbroken, as though no boot had disturbed it for days. And yet they knew the abandonment could not have been long ago. The water, the lantern, the half-sliced bread, all of it told a story of a crew that had vanished suddenly, violently, impossibly recently. They moved to the galley next. The galley was the true heart of any ship, the one place where life always revealed itself. But here, life had been paused. Plates were arranged neatly on the table. A pot of stew rested on the stove, cold but not spoiled. A wooden spoon lay on its side. A thin trail of broth dried along its curve. Whoever had last touched it had done so gently, not in haste. A kettle sat over a pile of cooled embers. Someone had removed it from the flame before it boiled over. That simple act struck the investigators deeply. If a crisis had erupted, no one would have cared about a kettle. No one would have bothered to prevent a fire hazard. Yet someone had taken the time to behave normally, right before the abnormal took them. Near the entrance of the galley, a chair lay on its side. The only object on the entire ship that appeared out of place. But there were no marks on the floor to show it had been kicked or thrown. It was as if it had tipped over slowly, without force, perhaps after someone stood up from it too quickly. Or perhaps after that someone was no longer there to steady it. They opened the pantry. Rows of rations, tins, and barrels stood untouched. No sign of rationing. No rush. No theft. Nothing missing. Pirates would have taken food, alcohol, supplies. A starving crew would have left marks of desperation. A mutiny would have left a chaotic trail. Yet the pantry was untouched, pristine, preserved. From the galley, they moved to the crew quarters. The sleeping quarters were empty, but not abandoned. The bunks were neatly made. Blankets tucked. pillows-shaped. Several hammocks still swayed gently as the ship rocked. It looked like the crew had prepared for sleep or had just woken up. What unsettled the investigators most was how normal everything looked. There were no signs of struggle, no torn cloth, no defensive wounds on the walls or floors, no stains, no broken furniture, no scratches, nothing that would indicate the crew had fought something or someone. But the personal belongings told another story, one far more deeply disturbing. A sailor's journal lay open on a bunk. The last entry was a rough, hurried note. "Something is wrong with the water tonight." That was all. No explanation. No scribbles. No panic in the handwriting. Just a statement of uneasy observation. Another bunk held a small wooden box. Inside were letters from home, a lock of hair tied with ribbon, and a small carved figurine. All items that sailors protected fiercely. If the crew had abandoned ship in a hurry, these would have been taken. No man leaves behind the last reminders of his family. A pipe lay beside one of the hammocks, tobacco still inside, as though it had fallen from someone's hand moments after being lit. The tobacco was dry now, but not aged. Someone had intended to smoke it. That intention had been cut short. They examined the walls. Something odd emerged. In certain corners, faint marks of moisture trickled downward, not from leaks in the ceiling, but as if condensation had formed suddenly and unnaturally. It wasn't enough to explain anything, but it added to the growing sense that the environment itself had changed in some strange way. Next came the captain's cabin, the room that held the most potential for answers. The investigators entered with caution. They had already seen the logbook, but now they viewed it with new eyes. The ink stroke ending mid-sentence was not jagged or smudged. It wasn't the handwriting of a man startled. It was the handwriting of a man who had ceased to exist in the middle of thought. Beside the logbook lay navigational maps. One map had been marked with an X far from their expected route. Notes scribbled around it read, "Unusual current, light on the horizon, sound beneath hull." The captain had clearly been aware of something unusual happening in the days before the disappearance. On the floor, a compass had rolled into the corner. When one of the men picked it up, he noticed something alarming. The needle spun unpredictably, failing to lock onto north. It jerked, trembled, and settled only for a moment before drifting. They checked a second compass. The same phenomenon occurred. Instruments failing. Logbooks interrupted. Crew gone. Ship untouched. They opened the captain's wardrobe. Inside, uniforms hung neatly. Boots polished. Instruments arranged on a shelf. All normal. But at the bottom, tucked into a corner, they found a small cloth wrapped around something solid. When they unwrapped it, they discovered a metal cylinder, a listening tube. A device used to press against the ship's hull to hear underwater vibrations. The captain had been listening to something beneath the ship, and whatever he heard made him wrap the device hurriedly and hide it. That detail shook the investigators. A captain does not hide equipment without reason. If the crew had panicked and abandoned ship, they would have taken the lifeboats. But only one was missing, and the ropes suggested it had never been lowered. The hull from the outside showed no sign of impact. No scrape marks. No cracks. Nothing to indicate the ship had struck anything. Yet something had moved beneath it. Something the captain felt compelled to monitor closely enough to use the listening device. They moved next to the upper decks and examined the rigging. The lines were taut. Knots were perfect. No signs of hurried work or neglect. But the sails told a different story. The edges were damp, as though a fine mist had clung to them. Not rain, they checked for that. Not ocean spray, the pattern was too uniform. It was as though the ship had passed through something moist and unseen. Then they revisited the stern. The missing lifeboat puzzled them most. The ropes hung clean, uncut, but the absence of the boat itself made no sense. If it hadn't been lowered, how had it vanished? Boats don't detach themselves. And if someone had taken it, why leave the ropes untouched? One investigator suggested the boat had been lost in a storm, but the others immediately dismissed it. The deck showed no storm damage. The sails were intact. The ropes were dry and strong. Then someone noticed something strange near the railing, a set of handprints. Not dirty, not bloody, just faint impressions of skin oil on the wood, as if someone had grasped the railing firmly, leaning over it. The prints were spaced far apart, too far for one person with both hands. It looked like two different men had leaned over the edge. Or three. But beneath those prints were long, thin streaks running downward, like marks left by wet fingertips sliding to the edge. It was impossible to tell if those marks were made in panic, in awe, in surrender, or in something else entirely. The investigators returned to the cargo hold one last time. This time, the rhythmic sound did not greet them. The hold was silent, completely silent. They opened crates, tested beams, studied shadows. Everything was normal, except they found a wet patch on the floor, perfectly round, small, as if a drop of water had fallen from nowhere. The ceiling above it was dry. The crates beside it were dry, yet the droplet glistened as though it had fallen seconds earlier. It was the final clue, the final contradiction. A ship dry everywhere except one impossible spot. As they stood there, a chilling realization swept through them. The clues did not point toward a human danger. They did not speak of pirates or mutiny or storm. They pointed toward something that had moved silently through the ship, something that left no trace of struggle, something that erased a crew without disturbing a single rope or spoon or letter, something that came and left without ever being seen. And in the hollow quiet of that abandoned vessel, they understood they were no longer investigating a crime. They were witnessing the aftermath of an encounter. Something had approached the ship. Something had entered it. Something had taken its crew. And whatever it was, it had not been human. For days, investigators, sailors, and officers gathered around the abandoned vessel, trying to make sense of the impossible. They searched every plank, every nail, every chamber, hoping for a trace, a message, a pattern. But the deeper they looked, the more the silence of the ship pushed back, as if guarding something it refused to reveal. It wasn't until a maritime historian arrived, a quiet man with decades of experience studying unexplained disappearances, that the investigation shifted. He boarded the ship alone, walking its decks slowly, listening to the way the wood echoed beneath his steps. He touched the ropes, examined the lanterns, knelt beside the faint handprints, and finally made his way to the captain's cabin. There he sat, studying the logbook's final words. "The men have begun to sense something." He whispered the sentence under his breath, repeating it several times, letting the cut-off word linger in the air. Something. But what? Something outside. Something inside. Something beneath? He flipped through earlier entries, reading notes about unusual currents, unexplained sounds under the hull, lights on the horizon that did not belong to any known ship. He traced the captain's crude sketches of those currents, lines swirling in unnatural patterns. The captain had not been recording routine problems. He had been documenting a growing fear, a pattern he couldn't yet define. The historian closed the logbook softly and stared at the wall. The ship creaked gently, whispering as if remembering something it should not have witnessed. After several hours alone, he returned to the waiting investigators. His face was pale, not frightened, but heavy, burdened by knowledge. He asked only one question. "Has anyone checked the water temperature around the hull?" The sailors exchanged confused glances. One man nodded hesitantly. "It's colder than the surrounding sea," he said. "Much colder. But that doesn't explain anything. It makes even less sense." The historian breathed deeply. "It explains everything," he murmured. He led them to the stern and had them drop a weighted thermometer into the water. When they pulled it back up, the reading showed temperatures impossible for that region, as though something deep and ancient had risen from colder realms and brushed against the ship. He asked for a second test, then a third. All readings were identical. Then he asked to see the listening tube they had found in the captain's cabin. He pressed it to the hull and listened. The ship was silent, but the historian remained still for a long time, eyes closed, face tight. When he finally pulled the tube away, the look in his eyes had changed. He asked a sailor, "When you first heard the sound in the cargo hold, was it rhythmic?" "Yes," the man replied, "like a slow pulse." The historian nodded, as if confirming something terrible. "This isn't the first ship to report that sound," he said quietly. "It's been documented twice before. Once in the 1600s, once in the 1700s, and now here." He gathered the men and told them a story they had never heard. Centuries ago, in the early days of long ocean voyages, sailors spoke of a phenomenon they called the deep visitor. They described a presence in the water, not a creature, not a storm, not a ghost, but something that moved with purpose. Ships that encountered it reported sudden temperature drops, strange currents, lights beneath the surface, and a sound like a heartbeat echoing up through the wood. Most ships survived. A few did not. None left an explanation. The phenomenon always struck the same way, silently, without violence, without evidence of attack. Crews disappeared. Ships remained intact. Meals left uneaten. Personal belongings untouched. It happened so rarely that historians dismissed it as myth, a legend told by lonely sailors staring too long into the dark. But the historian had spent his life collecting those stories, searching for patterns others ignored. And this ship matched them perfectly. Still, the sailors demanded logic. What could do this? What moved without leaving a mark? What took men but left their boots aligned and their pipes half-packed? The historian didn't answer immediately. He hesitated, weighing whether to speak the truth he believed. Finally, he said, "Sometimes the ocean behaves like a living thing, and sometimes it remembers we are trespassers." He explained that deep beneath the surface, far deeper than any man had dived in those centuries, there were currents older than civilization. Cold, slow, shifting streams that carried not just water, but forms of life adapted to impossible pressures. Creatures that had evolved in isolation for millions of years, unseen by human eyes. Creatures sensitive to vibrations, to heat, to movement. Most avoided the warmth of the upper ocean. But occasionally, under rare conditions, something rose. Something large. Something slow. Something curious. What if, the historian said softly, the crew felt something under the ship? What if the captain heard it through the tube? What if it surfaced beneath them? The sailors looked at each other uneasily. A few scoffed. One muttered that such things were impossible, that no creature could rise undetected. But the historian was not speaking of violence. He was speaking of behavior, of instinct. What if, he continued, the creature did not attack? What if it simply investigated? What if the crew panicked, fled in terror, and something, current, pressure, suction, pulled them away? This theory unsettled them all. It didn't explain everything, but it explained enough to make the mystery feel disturbingly real. Still, one man protested. What about the missing lifeboat? The ropes were untouched. The historian responded, when large things move in the water, they create forces no man can understand. A rising body could have lifted the lifeboat away without touching the ropes. Another asked about the handprints on the railing. Men grasp what they do not understand, the historian said. They lean over the edge to see what calls to them. But then came the final question. And the crew? Where are they now? Silence settled over the group. The historian's eyes lowered, as though he were searching for words that would not come. Finally, he said, the ocean takes what it wants. It does not return everything it touches. No one spoke after that. The story, the theory, the sound in the hull, all of it weighed heavily on their minds. They knew the historian wasn't claiming certainty. He was offering the closest thing to truth the records could provide. But there was one more revelation. When they returned to the captain's cabin, the historian opened the drawer beside the desk. He reached inside and pulled out a folded sheet of paper no one had noticed. It was a rough sketch, the last thing the captain had drawn before writing his final entry. It depicted a shape beneath the ship. Not detailed, not monstrous, just a shadow. A suggestion of something enormous, rising from depths too dark to imagine. The drawing wasn't meant to frighten. It was meant to warn. Below it, in hurried handwriting, the captain had written a single line. It is listening. Those were his last words. The investigators stood in silence, staring at the sketch. Beneath their feet, the abandoned ship creaked softly. As if remembering the night, something surfaced alongside it, something that should have remained unseen. The historian closed the drawer, turned to the men, and spoke the final truth they would ever hear about the missing crew. Whatever visited this ship gave it back. He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. But it did not give back the men. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the ship in a long shadow over the cold water, the investigators finally understood. They had not been studying a disappearance. They had been standing on the deck of a survivor. A ship that had lived. A crew that had not.